Good evening, everyone. My name is Kai Bird. I'm the current executive director of the Leon Levy Center for Biography. Can everyone hear? Okay. This is actually the 10th, going on the 11th anniversary of the Leon Levy Center for Biography, and which is an unusual institution, fully funded by one person, Shelby White, and the Leon Levy Foundation in memory of her late husband. And every year we have 4 fellows that we award $65,000 to. Next year it jumps to 72. And our current fellows are Bruce Weber, writing on E.L. Doctorow, Eleanor Randolph on Michael Bloomberg, Justin Gifford on Eldridge Cleaver, and Lindsay Whalen on the poet Mary Oliver. And finally, we have a dissertation fellow. We give a fellowship to a CUNY graduate student who this year is Mickey Kaufman, working on Henry Kissinger. We also do events like this. Most recently, we've had a wide range of biographers, including Max Boot on Edward Lansdale, Stephen Kotkin on Joseph Stalin. Our own Associate Director, Thad Zilkowski, recently interviewed Chris Kraus on Kathy Acker. He also moderated a panel at the Montclair Literary Festival recently with Joe Hagan on Jan Wenner, and Warren Zanes on Tom Petty, and David Yaffe on Joni Mitchell. Unfortunately, last week, the snowstorm canceled an event with Justin Spring on his new book, The Gourmands, but we're hoping to reschedule that in the near future. Looking ahead, on April 27th, I will be interviewing Stuart Eisenstadt on his fat, big biography of Jimmy Carter in his White House years. And finally, I want to mention that we are hosting here on May 18th to the 21st a really special conference in conjunction with an organization called Biographers International Organization, which is a terrific membership group of over 400 working and aspiring biographers. And they and we have put together a 2.5-day conference that will include more than 20 panels on a variety of topics. And I strongly encourage you all to consider looking at BIO's website and signing up. This conference is actually going to cost, you have to buy a ticket to attend, but I dare say it'll be worth it. Tonight, however, we have 2 very special writers with us. I have known Michael Massing for decades. He tells me that he thinks we first met when I hired him to write a piece at The Nation magazine, and then I never published it. That's an old story at The Nation. But we're still friends. And Michael has always been a Renaissance man, ironically. He's been editor of the Columbia Journalism Review, co-founder of the Committee to Protect Journalists, and a frequent contributor to the New York Review of Books. In 1992, he was named a MacArthur Fellow, and in 2010-11, he was a Leon Levy Fellow here at CUNY, working on this book. He is the author of several other books, but I'm glad to report that he has finally become a biographer. As my blurb on the back cover says, Fatal Discord is a stunning achievement. I'm also glad that Todd Gitlin is here tonight to interrogate Michael. Todd, too, is a Renaissance man, having authored at least 16 books, including the 60s, which I think is still the best single history of that tumultuous decade. Professor Gitlin has taught at Berkeley, NYU, and now Columbia University. I'd like to think that these events dedicated to biography are sort of a haven for intellectual thought away from sort of the craziness of our times, and a way to avoid speaking about he whose name should not be named. But oddly, somehow, I wager that Michael's very good book about Martin Luther and Erasmus is in some ways the best book around to understand our current predicament. And on that mysterious note, I turn the evening over to Todd Gitlin.
Thank you, Clay. So, Michael, you write in the book that up to a certain age was beyond childhood. I'm not sure just how many years you had already logged without really knowing much about Christianity. So, can you walk through your discovery of the intrigues and appeals and the riveting qualities of Christianity as a subject? How did you get here?
Yes, I guess I'm, first of all, let me thank Kai for helping organize this, and Thad and to the Biography Center for their support, which was invaluable. And my agent, Kathy Robbins, is here, so I'll take the opportunity to thank her and Todd for coming. So well into my 40s, I would say, or early 40s, I was basically ignorant about Christianity. I was raised in a semi-suburban Jewish neighborhood in Baltimore, and like most people of my background, I went to Hebrew school and was studiously kept from all things Christian. I feel that there is a worry among Jews in America that if they expose their kids to the New Testament, to learn about Peter and Paul and so on, or read the Gospels and Epistles, that they'll somehow get sucked up into the hegemonic faith and culture of America. So I was walled off from it. And it was largely, I know that Todd has heard this before, but I started visiting Rome in the 90s. I had friends there, and walking around the city, I was sort of transfixed by both the majesty of the city's history and my own ignorance of it. The rise and fall of the Roman Empire was something I knew little about. And then going to the churches of Rome was itself a transformative experience for me, particularly going to the Vatican and walking around the acres of marble and all the sarcophagi and the monuments to the popes. So, at the same time, I was working as a journalist and writing about America and the world, and it just seemed like the forces of Christianity in America were having such a formative influence. And I really didn't understand its roots and whatnot. And so I began a reading program. I was also very interested in the Bible. How did the Bible come to be? I had read the Torah in Hebrew school and, just accepted sort of divinely given document. But as you get older, you begin thinking, well, who actually did write the Bible? And so I began becoming interested in all the research that was being done, remarkable research using the tools of languages and grammar and philology to pick apart the different books of the Old and New Testament and who wrote them. So I just began this reading, this personal tutorial, going up to Labyrinth Books, now Book Culture up at Columbia, taking books off the shelves about Rome, its rise and fall, and then reading biographies of Jesus and Paul and of the early church, and how, particularly interested as a Jew, how did this group of Jews who ended up supporting Jesus and who were persecuted, sort of a sect, how in the course of 3 months did it go from being such a marginal group to conquering the Roman Empire? So I did all this, and ultimately, it was such a great story reading. Once I got to the collapse of Rome in 478, I just kept going and captured reading about the Middle Ages and then getting up to the Renaissance. And it was at that point, reading about the Northern Renaissance, that I discovered Erasmus. And this figure, this man who today is not that well known, was the greatest intellectual of his period. And he seemed just to anticipate so many things, intellectual trends and innovations of our time. And, he might be called the first liberal Democrat. He sort of believed in the social gospel, that people should try to emulate Jesus, and that the principles of compassion, mercy, brotherhood should prevail. He was basically close to being a pacifist, and did remarkable work on the New Testament. And this was what ultimately captured me, that I discovered that all this work that I had been reading about how the Bible came to be and how scholars were using all of these tools to pick it apart, really began, well, sort of with Petrarch before him, but Erasmus was the one who really found how to use language and grammar to pick apart the Bible. He felt the Bible had been, the translation of the Vulgate in Latin was inaccurate, full of mistakes, so he wanted to come up with a new version so that he could renovate Europe. And so here was a man, I've done a lot of press criticism in my day, and you read text very closely. Here was a man who taught himself Greek so that he could read the New Testament in its original language and do a new version of it, thereby hoping to spark basically a renovation of Christendom. And he got to a certain length until somebody else came along and pulled the stage away from him. But getting ahead.
So I can't help but notice that your path into Christianity was a path through a subversive. You did not, after all, decide to write the history of, the most preeminent popes. You went.
Well, when you say subversive, are you referring to Erasmus or Luther?
Erasmus.
Well, Luther too.
Well, we haven't gotten to Luther. We'll get to Luther.
Well,
but you found your quintessential Christian as a rebellion, as a rebellious one.
Well, remember, so I'm working as a journalist, and I'm doing this partly to go into the history of Western culture and try to find how we got to where we were. And when I read about Erasmus, I felt I had reached a figure who was at the start of one of the paths in European culture that ultimately led to the European Union. I argue in my book that the principles that Erasmus put forward, borderless Europe, social gospel, social welfare policies, peace, all these principles which he put forward and were suppressed for centuries and repressed. And he was blotted. In my book, I have a picture of his face, a drawing that's been blotted out, an example of how he was, the efforts to suppress him because he was subversive. This idea we should all live together as good Christians, even if we differ on the Trinity or the Eucharist. These were all terms I didn't know too much about beforehand, but it was, to me, very moving to see that this man who was a subversive and a moderate rebel, though, he wanted to stay within the church, was the forerunner of so much that seemed valuable in our world today.
So having fixed on Erasmus as your point of entry, was it clear that you also had to take on Luther?
Well, at first, I had no intention of doing that. Matter of fact, I was not planning to write a book at this point. I was just getting very excited about Erasmus. And then, he was the most, as I said, he was considered the new Cicero. People wrote letters to him so that he could write back and they could show to their friends, the great Erasmus has written me a letter. And yet today, he's so little known. I was at a writer's retreat in South Carolina, and I met somebody who was from New York, and when I told her that I was working on this book, on Erasmus and Luther, she said, I went to Erasmus High School in Brooklyn. And then she goes, who was Erasmus? So that sort of drove home to me how he had fallen into obscurity. And the reason was, as I read on, was Martin Luther. Luther was 15 years younger than Erasmus, and was an obscure monk when Erasmus came out with his New Testament, and was a great admirer of him. But the following year, he posted his 95 Theses on the door of the church in Wittenberg and suddenly became a household name. He became the leader of a more radical party to reform the church. And little by little, he outflanked Erasmus. And the two of them, who began as sort of comrades in arms, but with very different temperaments, became bitter rivals. And I'll never forget sort of the day that I was talking to my agent, Kathy, and talking to her about book ideas, and I mentioned this rivalry of Erasmus and Luther, and she said, I think there might be something there. I don't know if you remember that or not, but so he was also subversive, but of a much more radical one. So my book partly is about how does change come about? Do you take the moderate approach working within the institution, which Erasmus tried to do in the church, or do you come with an axe, with a hatchet, and try to chop the tree down like Luther did? And just one small note on this. People kept saying to Luther, moderate your language, because he was a bully. He was scatological. When he got into an argument, he just used the most insulting language toward people. We can talk maybe about modern parallels later. But people said, you're going to, and Erasmus urged him, you're going to promote violence by this language. And he said, by just chiding, you don't accomplish anything. You have an institution like the church, if you're nice and use moderate language, nothing will happen. And on one level, he was right, and on another, Erasmus was right, because the violence did come, and Luther's provocative language did help launch a century of religious violence in Europe.
Now, before we get back to Erasmus and Luther themselves, I want to try out on you an off-the-wall hypothesis I have, and if you don't like it, you don't have to pay my fee. It has to do with why you did this. Okay, because I was thinking about your trajectory. We've known each other for 20 years or so, and I've been following you writing about the press for a long time. And it strikes me that you were preoccupied, as many were, but you were more fruitfully than many in 2004-05 with the question of how the press had paved the way for George Bush to carry us into the catastrophe in Iraq. And you wrote a series of articles which collected under the title Now They Tell Us, referring to the late and lame proclamations from the headquarters of the Times and the Post about how they had gotten it wrong. And so this makes me wonder the following. Could it be that after years of investigating the malfeasance of our sort of reigning ministries of information, that you were driven or beckoned to look for deeper forces that were actually at work in making the world happen, and in particular making America what it was in the process of becoming, so that you were primed to look beneath superficial available evidence to deep rock bottom evidence of what's driving our story.
Not that wild. As I've told Todd, I try to, as he heard me talk another time, I try to avoid talking about how long I've been at work on this book. But I'm going to have to say now that, well, at least doing the preliminary research was before the Iraq invasion. So I was actually, through the 90s, I would say, aware of something that was going on in the world. And I think the rise of conservative Christianity, which of course George Bush himself, basically a born-again Christian, became president. So, but even before then, I was aware that our world was being shaped by these forces, and that I, raised as I was not really aware of where this was coming from. So I think that the writing about Iraq was itself a product. I was already trying to understand where these things were happening. So when George Bush used words like, it was very interesting that Bush used language that if you were conversant in the New Testament, you knew that he was referring to this book, Paul's epistle here. And I now hear these things. Some people call it dog whistles. I don't think that's really right. But when somebody talks about, things in the New Testament Like, Jesus, okay, I'm writing this piece now about if you want to understand, well, we're going to get ahead of ourselves, but Jesus says things like, not only does he say, turn the other cheek and love thy enemy, he also says at one point in Matthew, I come with a sword. I come not in peace, but with a sword. And I will turn father against son, and mother against daughter, and father-in-law against son-in-law. And there is this militant strain, and this is one of the things that most struck me reading the New Testament, that in addition to the irenic strain, there is this much more bellicose one. And so now I understand, like, much more where this sort of militancy in Christianity, parts of it, come from. And it's sort of this Lutheran strain, as opposed to Erasmus was very much the more irenic strain.
Okay, so let's go back to the 16th century. The one thing that's so striking in your account, and I want to ask in a minute about how evocative your account, I want to draw attention to how evocative your account is. But one thing that's so striking early on, you've already alluded to it, is that in so many ways, although the fight between the followers of Erasmus and the followers of Luther is ideological, it's doctrinal, it's also at least as much a fight in temperament. And how did you come, how did you come to understand how important temperament was in driving this breach?
No, absolutely. I alluded to that earlier about the moderate versus the sort of more firebrand approach. And I actually have to say I struggled a lot with Erasmus and his temperament because on the one hand, he's writing these books that are actually quite, in their own way, are radical because he's calling upon Christians not to kill one another in the name of Christ, which in that day was sort of radical. But at the same time, he did these things that were maddening. You know, he was so fussy. There was this famous line, you know, things that Erasmus is the product of a long line of maiden aunts. He also was a snob. He called people who didn't know grammar quite well enough barbarians. That was a common term of the period. And if you didn't know Greek, you weren't really a cultivated man. So I had to wrestle with these aspects of him. And one of the things that he's been most cited for is that, okay, so after Luther is, I don't want to get into too many details, Luther went into hiding at one point after the Diet of Worms, and people thought that he had been killed, but in fact there had been a fake abduction arranged by Frederick the Wise, the Prince of Saxony, and he was deposited. He was fake abduction by these horsemen and taken to the Wartburg Castle, where he hid for months. And people at that point were distraught that their leader of this whole movement to reform the church had been killed. And so they looked to Erasmus to step forward. And of all people, Albrecht Dürer, the great painter, who had become a very strong follower of Luther, wrote to Erasmus, who he also knew, and said, "Oh, Erasmus, you have said you don't have that many years left anyway. Please accept the martyr's crown, come forward, and stand up to the church and denounce." He was under great pressure to denounce Luther from his fellow churchmen, but he resisted because he knew that this would undercut his own plans. And Erasmus writes, you know, I have no intention of being a martyr. You know, the martyr's crown is not for me. And so people over a course of time have faulted him because he was not willing to sacrifice himself as Luther was. And I have to say that when it comes to Luther, I found myself admiring the courage and fearlessness of this man, who in many ways, though, his intolerance and his brutal language, you know, was so off-putting, and yet the way that he was willing to stand up for what he believed. And of course it was because he felt God had chosen him to do this. Erasmus had none of that. He didn't feel God had chosen anybody. And I came to like, so how do you write about that? And like, was he being a coward? And on the contrary, I came to feel that at a time when people were willing to kill one another over their beliefs, that Erasmus's unwillingness to engage in this was itself its own sort of, he was an anti-hero, but it was in its own way a very admirable form. I wouldn't call it heroism, but of sort of, decency to not participate in all that, so.
So speaking of how do you write about, I remember at one point we were having lunch during one of these few months when you were working on your book, and you talked about the extravagant anti-Semitism that characterized Luther famously, but Erasmus not so famously. How did you assimilate that? How do you understand the relation between the anti-Semitism and the Christian reformist passions, if there is a relationship?
Oh yeah, it's a huge subject. One of the disappointments as a Jew doing this work is, as you say, Todd, that Luther was anti-Semitic. We call it was actually anti-Judaism. Anti-Semitism is a term having to do with racial characteristics that came later. It was really that they were Jewish that he detested, that they would not accept Christ. And reading, I had read, Erasmus has like 3,000 letters that he's written and received, and I read through a lot of them. One of the reasons I decided to write the book is because these letters of both men are so revealing of the period. And when I got to this period where Erasmus starts writing about the Jews in the most negative, intolerant way, it sort of, took me aback. Did you want to say something? Yeah, no, it's a good point. Erasmus wrote exclusively in Latin, and Luther wrote in Latin and also in German, and I get into this in the book. One of the reasons that Erasmus ultimately, that he was unable to develop a broad base was because he was writing exclusively in Latin and for a very educated slice of the population. Well, so Luther, let me just say that he wrote a lot of pamphlets in both, some in Latin, but then he also wrote in German, which gave him access to a huge population. When he translated the Bible, I can't get it, but the Bible that was used was the Vulgate. It was in Latin, but it was a translation from Greek in the case of the New Testament and Hebrew in the case of the Old Testament. And so when he translated the New Testament, he was translating it from both Latin and using the Greek into German. And then he also learned Hebrew. It's amazing that this great anti-Jewish man loved Hebrew. I mean, he loved the Old Testament. Of the 35 years he spent lecturing on the Bible, he spent like 30 of them on the Old Testament and only 5 on the New. Right. He took the Vulgate in Latin and said, this is so full of errors, and all these doctrines come out of mistranslations, and even the scribal errors were in there. So he went back and read Greek, learned Greek, which was very hard because Greek had faded from the Latin West, so that he could go back to he found all these old manuscripts of the New Testament in Greek and did a new Latin translation. So, and that is what, I liken it to Copernicus's on the celestial revolution of the celestial planets, which came out a couple decades later, 3 decades later, in terms of the sort of the break in Western thinking, just as Copernicus led to our thinking that the earth revolved around the sun. Erasmus with this New Testament, which had hundreds of annotations explaining the errors in the Latin and why he was changing it, made the Bible into a much more seemingly man-made product. So people began to understand that every word was not given by God, but that had come about through all these translations and scribal mistakes and so on and so forth. So, so Luther loved the Old Testament. A friend of mine said that when she, who's a scholar, a medievalist, who specializes in Judaic studies, she said when she found out that Erasmus hated the Jews, that was it for her, with him. She wanted nothing more to do with him. But to me, it added to another layer that was fascinating. And I understood that anti-Jewish sentiment was so embedded in the medieval church and in medieval Christendom that even Erasmus was succumbed to it. You can only find one or two people who had a different view of the Jews in this period among the intelligentsia. So,
Who were they?
there's one fascinating guy named Andreas Osiander, who was a scholar in Nuremberg and a follower of Luther, and he studied Hebrew. And he just felt it was horrendous the way that Christians were treating Jews. And he stood out as one of the few people who, because the study of Hebrew was, just as the study of Greek was being revived, so was Hebrew. And so this is one of the paradoxes of the period. I think you read that one of those chapters out early on. That at the same time that this horrible anti-Jewishness was going on, there was a rediscovery of Hebrew, because it was, along with Greek, the ancient language that the Bible was written in. So all these people, all these Hebrew instructors and chairs in Hebrew studies are arising throughout. And I try to show how it was the reformers themselves who were in the forefront of the anti-Judaism, because why was Christianity so deformed? They blamed it on the Jews because Judaic rituals and ritualism, minute following of of practices, that had been seen as tainting Christianity. That is what the church was doing. You had to say confession in this way, and the priest had to put on the alb and the mantle in a certain way, and the censer, and that was Judaic adulteration of Christianity. So the reformers who wanted to get away from this and go back to a more spiritual Christianity blamed it on the Jews. So they were, it's a remarkable thing. And the horrors, the blood libels and the host desecration that were blamed on the Jews. And just, you read how 38 Jews were hung in one town because they supposedly, killed a Christian child and used the blood to make matzahs. I mean, it's just so chilling what you discover.
So one thing that's so striking to me is how grippingly lively your account is. And one reason is, I think, that these characters are not walking texts. They're actually recognizable human beings who not only read and write and criticize and fulminate, but also they walk, they take stagecoaches, they ride horses, they have conversations with others. How did you assemble this sense, it's wrong to say it's just a backdrop, it's a world. How did you assemble a sense of the world they inhabited so that it seems both familiar in that we could imagine ourselves living there, but also as weird as it deserves to, because, as somebody said, the past is a foreign country, they do things differently there. How did you get that?
Well, let me preface my answer by acknowledging your own part in, if you recall, when we had a lunch about, when you had read some chapters and you pushed me to talk more about the actual tactile, palpable nature of things. And Todd had this view, the chamber pot theory of history, where you really want to evoke sort of what it was like to live. And actually when you...
Especially important for Luther, given
his...
Important of excretion.
Yes, he was so profane and always writing about his backside, and he actually suffered from terrible constipation at one point, which led to Erik Erikson's, you probably all know, speculations about the link between his buttocks and his revolt against the church. So you get fascinated by sanitation in these periods. And, what did they do with waste? And it was all present, a constant problem, and it was so prevalent. believe it or not, when I was trying to conjure up what it might have been like, I thought of the one time I went to Afghanistan in 2002, where you don't have sanitation in villages too, and it like, the smell and the nature of things, I like tried to channel that. So you get involved in some creative conjecturing with this, but these letters that I referred to are so full of details about these things. For instance, Erasmus loved going to England. I think he went there 5 times, but he hated crossing the English Channel. And I mentioned in my book, for anyone who has taken a hovercraft across the Channel or now a train, and it took days on these packed boats. And Erasmus wrote about his fear of having to take this trip and everybody gets seasick and the wind, the storms, people died regularly on these crossings. So reading his letters, I sort of I tried to recreate what that would be like. And then also I went in the footsteps of both men. I did one tour of Erasmus, who largely spent time, he was from Rotterdam and spent time in Holland, but then he was in Louvain, Belgium, and Paris, and then the Rhineland. That was the great cultural artery of the period. And he traveled up and down and ended up in Basel. So I went to a lot of these places, and you can evoke it. I went to Deventer, this town in Holland. I begin my first chapter by saying, the landmark cities of the Reformation are well known. There's Wittenberg, and there's Prague, where Jan Hus was, and Geneva of John Calvin, and so on. But this town, Deventer, I tried to make a case, is one of the well springs of the Reformation, because that's where Erasmus went to school and went to Latin school there. And the Latin school, a version of it, is still there across from the Grote Kerke, the giant cathedral there. And you can get a sense, this town is on a river, and boats would come in, and ideas would come in with it, and the printing press was still, you could buy beautiful, printed books in the lovely stores of this town. And then I went to central Germany to see where Luther grew up. And so I was driving to the town of Eisleben, where he was born. And as I'm getting there, I see these giant mounds. There were these dark structures rising hundreds of feet, and I had no idea what it was. And as I got there, I saw that they were refuse heaps from the mines in the region, going back hundreds of years. They're still there. They're all over. They're on the sides of roads. They're behind apartment complexes and so on. And some of them went back to Luther's time. And he grew up in a mining culture. His father owned some smelters. And so I really explored what it was like, what the region might have looked like back then. And you just get a sense, and it's surrounded by woods. So while Erasmus is this man who's going along the Rhine and writing these pamphlets on the boats and going to Basel, this wonderful city on the Rhine, Luther is, in landlocked Germany and becomes he only left once Germany to go to Rome. In his monastic order, there was a dispute, and 2 people were picked to present the case before before the order of the Augustinians in Rome. So he was selected, and like friars in those days, they could only go by walking. So he walked the 800 plus miles to Rome and back over the passes of the Alps, and I tried to reconstruct what that might have been like. So I even looked up weather, in Germany in certain months, and then tried to think what it must have been like in the middle of winter in Wittenberg, where he spent most of his time as a friar.
So of course it would be vulgar to suggest that he lived a constipated life.
It's really, the constipation itself is fascinating. And how it was treated. He was in such agony for periods of time. I tried to recreate with that when he was in the Wartburg, desperate for laxatives that were then sent by post to him. But just one funny thing, when I went to Eisleben and then Mansfeld, which is a nearby town where I spoke to an American pastor there, and he had been there for a couple of years, serving as a minister in a Lutheran church. And he started talking about how the people in Mansfeld and in that whole region were extremely brusque to the point of being rude, And this was to me, enlightening, because there's all these questions about Luther and his vulgar language and his, just how brutal he was to people. And like, this is part of the mining culture, it's like, you don't have to know about his buttocks and what his father might have done to beat him, which is what Erickson builds this whole thing on. It's more the mining culture of the town. And so going to these places was a very eye-opening experience.
So let's talk a little bit about the Reformation itself, and then throw.
Does anybody have a question, meanwhile? We'll just have one, and then.
Sure.
Richard, hi.
Did Luther have a sense of humor? If he did, how did it show itself? If it didn't, how important is that?
He did have an extremely, again, very sarcastic, biting, chiding sense of humor. And his letters are often extraordinary to read for that. And the letters that he and Erasmus exchanged, there are only about a half dozen or so. The two never met, but they were intense rivals, conducted through pamphlets and letters and promotional activities and so on and so forth. And in one letter, when Luther is seeking early on Erasmus's support, he adopts what is known as the abundant style, which is this ornate Latin. So you see this letter written in a form, "Oh, dear Erasmus, that I have not written you sooner is due to the fact that I am in such, have such respect for your learning," and so on. And it's so clunky. You can just see how he can't really write in that form. And his letters are just full of bantering and mockery. And Erasmus did as well. He was, The Praise of Folly is a work ultimately of great satire. And, his ridicule was something that the church, people, I say, and others before me have said the same, that the church withstood many attacks, but Erasmian ridicule was one that it wasn't prepared to repel. So both of them were extraordinary writers, and that was one of the joys of reading these letters and being able to quote from them.
So I have a question about the Reformation, and which
My book, incidentally, is about.
But it's also a question about the present. So the Reformation is, I think, obviously foundational. This country was founded by, and American culture was founded by severe Protestants, shall we say, creatures of the Reformation. Now, as I read your account, it's underscored that there are two weirdly discordant elements in the Reformation that both seem to be rooted in the same period and the same discourse. So on the one hand, Luther says, go to the text. Your salvation is through the text, reading. Your act of piety, your act of fidelity to God, it has to do with reading. And reading is a solitary act. So in that sense, the Reformation is the school of individualism. Okay, so don't rely on those priests. They're crooks, they're thieves, they're liars, they're no goods in every way you can think of. So it's in that sense, the Reformation is a hymn to the responsibility of individuals. On the other hand, the Reformation and Protestantism is also a hymn to the tribe. It's also a hymn to the congregation as a whole. So when Luther and his Epigones break with the Pope, they're not breaking in behalf of anarchy and wild individualism. They're breaking in behalf of the idea of the nature of the true church, which is a collective thing. It's an anti-hierarchical thing, but it's a collective thing. So individualism and tribalism both have their root here. What do you make of that?
Well, it's a good question and a complicated one. Part of what I try to do in my book in the final chapter, so I argue that basically Erasmus's ideas found their major flowering in Europe, and that Luther's ideas found their main outlet in America. And the latter idea is I encountered tremendous resistance when I would interview theologians or religious historians, mainly Christian ones. And it's Calvin. America's all Calvin. Nobody thinks that Luther's influence here is that strong. And I'm just like, the whole journey I'm making is partly because I'm trying to understand what's going on in our world, and I just see the individualism, that you can read the text on your own. He had this great concept, which I trace the origins and then how it unfolded. The priesthood of all believers. As Todd said, don't forget the priests and theologians. Every believer can be his own priest. So this is like an extreme individualism. And you are alone, it's your faith. It was scripture and faith. By faith alone, by scripture alone were his watchwords. And so it's your faith before God. You don't go to, not only does the priest not tell you what to read, he's not going to absolve you in confession. You have to have a change in your heart. Calvin was much more about the elect and the sort of the New Jerusalem, and that was if you look at New England, the Calvinists were all about the community, social welfare. That's what happened, and 4 Quakers got hung because they were dissenting from the community and unsettling it. So I try to argue in my book that this individualism is where you see Luther's influence, and that the Calvinist influence I see much more in the Christian right, where they are trying to remake society. And I think that the Lutherans followers, who are the evangelicals, do not. That they believe much more it's the individual has to be accountable before God, read scripture on your own and the like. So I'm not really addressing the tribalism. I think that Luther was a populist, so I argue that. And this aspect has become more prominent in my own mind as our current, what's going on in the world today. And I've written this piece about how I feel that to understand Donald Trump, you have to look at Martin Luther. And so much of this anti-establishment, the church, these are the credentialed elites, and don't listen to them, go off, and you can be your own person, and you're responsible for yourself, personal responsibility, which you hear a lot in the evangelical churches. I think, again, a lot of it goes back to Luther.
Wasn't one of Luther's big slogans, "Drain the swamp"? But seriously, we haven't talked about Luther's politics and his relation to the princes. What followed the Protestant upheaval were brutal wars. Millions of people died. As you point out at one point, it's thought that something like 1/3 of the population of Germany died in the 30 Years' War. So, and Luther took a lot of heat from yet more radical elements for siding with the princes.
Right.
So, coming back to draining the swamp, is there here some eerie parallel that he who proclaims the necessity of draining the swamp is actually looking for another authority structure to sustain him and to reward with his aura?
Yeah, you're absolutely right, and I only belatedly I think, pieced together how this has played out. So a key thing, very quickly, so Luther, the radical, the subversive, has the priesthood of all believers. You can read the Bible on your own. Well, after the Diet of Worms in 1521, in that period right after then, when he stood up to the Emperor Charles V and refused to recant his works, it's one of the most amazing moments in European history. People began taking him seriously and began reading the Bible on their own. And the German peasants, inspired in part by him and also by these preachers who were going around reading from Luther's New Testament, although it wasn't just religious, but in southwestern Germany, the serfs and others rose up, and there was the German Peasants' War. It was the largest uprising in Europe before the French Revolution. And at one point, it looked like they were going to take over all Germany. And Luther was in a period where he became terrified at what he had unleashed. So he does this pivot, and he begins writing, actually before the Peasant War, about your right is to believe what you want is an internal thing. It does not mean that you are to imply it in the real world. This very much relates to America too. So you can read the Bible and you're responsible for God, but do not try to then act in the real world. And so when the peasants rose up, Luther was asked to write about this, and he wrote some of his most violent and vicious tracts. One is called Against the Murdering Hordes of Peasants, and he actually called on the princes to smite, slay, and stab every peasant. And if you die in the course of it, you are blessed because you are doing the work of the Lord. And he saw the princes ultimately as the ones that God had put in place. According to Romans 13, respect the governing authorities. That became his watchword. And so he turned on the peasants. So this man who had basically said, read the Bible and this should be your guide, turned on them when they did. And over 100,000 peasants were killed in the most barbaric ways possible. Luther's reputation suffered in a way that he never recovered. He was called a toady of the princes, that he saved his own skin by joining with them. And so, Todd, you're absolutely right that if you look today and you look at what goes on, there's both this, okay, these elites are controlling your life, we need an uprising against these people with degrees and so on. But when it comes to actually changing, making societal change, reforming the world to basically address the grievances, no, that's basically not on the agenda.
What else should I ask you? What would you like to be asked?
Let's see what they want to say.
Alex.
You say peasants were to read the Bible. I didn't know they were literate.
Well, that's a good point. I mean, the priesthood of all believers, so every believer was to be empowered. But a lot of them, they went to church and they heard the pastors do it. And there were all these itinerant pastors who went around. And in 1525, in the town of Memmingen, this manifesto, the 12 Articles, was promulgated as that was what united all the peasants. Memmingen today calls itself the town of human rights because it's supposedly the first charter of human rights. And it was all based on the Bible. Not all of it, but much of it. The Bible says no man should own another. And it cites the Gospels. And the whole idea of liberating the serfs was in this document based on a reading of the Bible. But you're absolutely right, most of them. Literacy rates outside the cities were very low. Dale?
The mic is on its way to you.
Michael, this is so fascinating, and I can't
Dale
wait to-
Press,
I
a
can't- I
very
can't wait-
fine writer in his own right.
And as a fellow journalist who tries to excavate history occasionally, as you know, journalism is often referred to as the first draft of history. This is clearly not a first draft of the lives of these two figures or these events or these debates. So I'm really curious to know what you felt, with your training, with your skills, with your background, with your Jewish background, but also as a writer, as someone who investigates and looks differently and is trained differently than scholars. What did you feel you were going to add that this story was missing?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. I do in my opening talk about how precisely journalists said to write the first draft, and in writing about the Reformation, I was doing maybe the 500th draft. But it's like when you go to a foreign country and you don't necessarily know the languages or the culture or whatnot, and many other journalists have been based there reporting on a war, on a conflict, or whatever. But when you go with fresh eyes, and you notice things that others either have not noticed or have not, connected in ways that are there. So for instance, the rivalry of Erasmus and Luther. All books about the two men talk about it, but there are very few books that put it at the center. And by doing so, I felt I was able to write about this fault line in history where you have this sort of the humanist. I haven't even mentioned the word humanist. I mean, Erasmus was not the father of humanism, that was Petrarch, who lived 150 years earlier, but he was the greatest exemplar. So it's the origins of humanism and the origins, I'm arguing, of evangelical Christianity. And nobody has sort of like, in going into doing the excavation, really sort of has seen it in that way. And so I did feel like as a journalist you have certain, and telling the story in a way too that I think a lot of more scholarly works have more trouble doing.
What about the title, Fatal Discord? It's a beautiful, resonant phrase. It seems like a musical metaphor, but I kind of don't think it. Where did you get that?
Yeah, somebody told me it sounded like a Robert Ludlum title, and I said, well, great. And this is actually a regret I have, and if I ever get to do another edition. So it comes from a letter that Erasmus wrote to Luther, in which he says, if you keep up this level of rhetoric and violent language so the term in the letter that I have is fatal dissension, but one of the biographies translates it as fatal discord. And from the very start, as my agent can attest, I had that as the title. But it's funny, when I actually cited that letter in chapter 38 or 39, I put fatal dissension, and it's only in a little footnote that I say, this can also be translated fatal discord, so it should have been as a parenthetical remark in the text to let readers know. But
Would you tell us about Luther's experiences as a monk and what drove him to, join the order? And from what I remember vaguely, he was a very devout Catholic.
Absolutely, yeah.
And also, I want to mention that the difference between a Northern Renaissance painting and a Southern Renaissance painting is about $500,000. So that's how we value it today.
that's good. Well, Dürer, I think, goes for a lot of money. No, thank you. Throughout the book, I avoid use of the term monk. This is actually a matter of controversy because he belonged to the Augustinian hermits, and they were more properly mendicants, which means they were friars. So whereas a monk just generally stays in the monastery, the mendicants, which include the Franciscans and Dominicans, went out to preach and to minister to the poor. So he was he was really more of a friar. This gets to this remarkable story of this man who, whereas Erasmus ultimately, you feel that deep down faith did not mean that much to him. It was your conduct that mattered. Luther burned for a sense of certainty about his fate. He grew up with this image of a judging God, and even as he trained, he was, did very well in school. And his father, who was this mining, early capitalist in the mining industry, wanted him to be a lawyer so that he could help out with the family business. And so he dutifully, in the town of Erfurt, went to school and studied law. But then one day he was visiting his parents, walking, 40 miles to see them. And on the way back, he got caught in a thunderstorm. And he fell to the ground. And in his extremity and fear, he said, "Saint Anne, I will become a monk," or friar. No, he said, I guess a monk, if I'm saved. And so he made it through. He got back to Erfurt. St. Anne was the patron saint for the miners, so it meant a lot. And he followed through. Many people, when they made these type of oaths, they just, ignored them. But no, he did. But he had a burning desire. His soul was tormenting him. He felt that he was full of sin no matter what he did. So there's this moment when he ends up going to walk from the university to enter the monastery or whatever, the cloister. And his friends are going, why are you doing this? You have such promise. No, I want to go. And so he tried to obey all the strictures of the church. How to dress, how to pray. They prayed 7 times a day, the hours, praying the Psalter. He went to confession. He became a brilliant, not a confessor, giving confession. Because every Friday they would go, and he would do an inventory of everything that he had done wrong. I mean, bad thoughts. He wasn't troubled by sexual desires, which was the main thing that most friars and monks had. It was more his pride and his haughtiness. And so he would be contemptuous of a fellow monk, so he would start confessing. Confessions began going an hour and then 2 hours, and they went up to 6 hours. And so when the confessors saw Luther coming, they went, "Oh, Gewalt, what am I going to do here?" But nothing he did ultimately made him feel like he was being absolved. The priest would say, "They absolve all," but he did not believe it. He began reading Augustine, the idea of original sin and the incorrigibility of human nature and perfectibility. And so he developed his own interpretation of the gospel, that it was about human sin was ineradicable, and only through divine grace and faith in God could you find a path to salvation.
Michael, would you say something about the women?
Erasmus did not have much experience with women. He was in the monastery too for 6 years, and I talk about how, whereas Luther went into the monastery to find his salvation, Erasmus left the monastery to see the world and try to make a mark on it. And in the monastery, he developed this intense crush on another monk. And it's all documented in his letters. I mean, how he couldn't eat, he couldn't sleep, and so on and so forth. And so there's all this speculation about his sexual proclivities, which we cannot ultimately resolve. But Luther also operated in an all-male, largely male world. But then there's this famous story, which I can't get into at length, but because of his writings, the monasteries and convents around Germany began emptying. He was denouncing the monastery because he saw that it was a false promise. You could never get to heaven that way. And so this convent, these 12 nuns wanted to leave, but it was very hard for them to do. It was actually could be to help an escaping nun was a capital offense. So he calls this friend of his who had a wagon developing herring to the convent, and they arranged for the nuns to be bundled into this carriage, and took them out, and they got into Saxony, and 9 of them ended up in Wittenberg, and Luther found places for all but 3 of them. They got taken up by families or whatnot. So they began living in Wittenberg, and he got quite close to them, and he was really one of them he was taken with, and she was taken with him. But people began saying, you should marry because you can set an example. This was a big thing at the time. That was one of the major ways you made a break with the church as a priest. You got married. And it created such an uproar. And so he would not marry, though, this one woman who was interested in him. And he said the reason was that he expected to die. So he did not want to do it. But that woman and her sister got married off, and there was left one woman that could not be placed, Katharina von Bora. Very headstrong woman, very capable. And she began making the moves on Luther. And Luther resisted. He found her too haughty. And as he said, I did not burn for her. But ultimately, they got married. And one of the most extraordinary scenes was he announces in a letter as a peasant war is ending and 100,000 peasants have been slaughtered. He's been denouncing them, and he announces in a letter, I plan that when I get back to Wittenberg, he'd been traveling, I will marry Katharina von Bora. And his colleagues were appalled at a time when, as one of them wrote, when smoke is still rising from these cities that have been ravaged, you are going to get married. And Luther was such a cussed guy, you know, he wanted to stick it to all these people. And so he not only arranged to get married, he had a big celebration, a big dance in Wittenberg, and he invited all these people. And so about a month after the war had ended, the peasant uprising ended, he got married and took over the cloister, which you can go still see in Wittenberg, and they turned it into a Luther's home. It's called the Luther House. And Katharina turned out to be, Luther did end up burning for her. And he writes about sex in the most frank ways, which is remarkable. And to this day, Protestantism, is much more open. We're not talking about necessarily evangelical Protestantism, but like the Lutheran Church in America is the most liberal church when it comes to sexuality. I mean, they endorse same-sex marriage very early on. And a friend of mine, Christine Helmer, who was a Lutheran theologian, very helpful, she says, really, you can see the line from Luther marrying Katharina von Bora to the stance of Lutherans today.
So, do you have time for another question?
Yeah, sure.
Okay.
As long as
So
you...
I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about Erasmus's friendship with Thomas More,
Yeah.
and how that may or may not have affected his relationship and his views of Luther.
The views of Luther, I don't know about his views of Luther, but his views in general, I mean, I talk quite a bit about them because he was his closest friend. Oh, God, I have these scenes in the book where, so his first trip to England, Erasmus, when it's in 1499, so he's about 30-something. And he immediately, because he knows good Latin and knows how to ride a horse, he's accepted into English society. And he meets all this band of humanists who are there. And the leading one is Thomas More. Thomas More was 8 years younger than he, but immediately Erasmus was taken with him. He commented on how good-looking More was, but also More was brilliant and witty. So one day, More and Lord Montjoy, who was Erasmus had been tutoring, says, let's go to Eltham and meet the young prince. So they go there, and it's Prince Henry. Prince Henry is the son of Henry VII, who is then king. And Prince Henry is 8 years old. And More had been told that they were going to meet the prince. And so he had composed a verse in Latin for him. And Erasmus was not told. And Henry, young 8-year-old Henry, was disappointed and asked Erasmus to compose something. So 3 days Erasmus spent composing this florid poem in Latin about Henry VII and his offspring, and so gave it to the prince. Well, that prince, 9 years later, became Henry VIII. And so here you have this moment where Thomas More and Erasmus are meeting this prince, and Erasmus became both close to Henry, but also kept his distance because he was this absolutist king. And so you have Thomas More, the two of them ended up really helping. More was Erasmus's fellow, colleague in trying to introduce a new form of writing and of letters in Europe, getting beautiful Latin, studying Greek, And so and they translated Lucian, the Greek satirist from the 2nd century, and this prepared Erasmus to then do the Praise of Folly, because Lucian was this loved satire, and if you go back, he was in the 2nd century in what's now Syria, and just wrote these rollicking dialogues and early forms of science fiction, and More and Erasmus were enchanted by this, because there was so much deadened scholasticism that they were rebelling against. So the two of them, and I try to chart then how the tragic different paths that they took, and Erasmus got more and more aghast that his friend turned out to be who joked and bantered and never seemed to take matters of faith that seriously, became such a strong, Catholic defender, to the point where obviously he lost his life to the later version of that 8-year-old prince that they had met so innocently at that early period. Todd, why don't you call?
Sure. Hold on a second. Amplification is on its way.
Earlier you mentioned that Erasmus was somewhat bellicose.
Somewhat
Bellicose?
No, Erasmus was the Irenic, was the peaceful one. Luther was bellicose.
You also mentioned that some points that he took out of the Bible were somewhat, I understood you saying that he wasn't always seeking peace, but there was a feistiness in him and
Erasmus? Or no, I think that was Luther, if I misspoke about that, yeah. Erasmus always fought that, and Luther was attracted to the epistles, which are much more about faith, Paul's epistles, whereas Erasmus liked the Gospels, and he liked the Sermon on the Mount. He was ultimately more a Sermon on the Mount type of Christian, as is now Pope Francis, who I think is very much like a very Erasmian pope. So.
My second question is this coming out in paperback?
We don't know. We have no idea. We'll have to see how this goes. Why? Sure. Is it too heavy, or? Okay. It's available on Kindle.
Don't wait.
Back to the question of language. What language were More's works published in? Weren't they published in English?
More did both. He wrote a lot of, he wrote panegyrics, and he also wrote these epigrams. I talk about, going back a little bit to your earlier question, that More and Erasmus were the odd couple, that Erasmus was very fussy. He was very far in advance about hygiene. He hated the floors of English houses, which were covered by these reeds and bulrushes, and were there for 20 years, he would say, and like urine and vomit and dregs of food, and he felt that this, he really, was talking about, you need to air these places out and open the windows and so on and so forth, whereas More was very scatological also, and wrote these epigrams about, wiping your nose and so on and so forth. And they were remarkably in Latin. But then he, later on, wrote in English, particularly when he wrote in both. Again, like Luther, he had a dual thing. If he wanted to address the elite, he would write in Latin. But if he wanted to do these, he did these polemics, particularly against William Tyndale, who translated the Bible into English, and More and he went to war with one another, and so he wrote these. He was very scatological as well.
Also, you haven't really said anything about nationalism and the languages and the different cultures that begin to develop distinguish places because of nationalism, but the church was never nationalist, was it?
But that what?
Was the church ever nationalist?
The church was Christendom. So it was the idea of a universal institution.
So did these people grow up as part of the dynamic for nationalism?
Erasmus wrote all these works. One had a great title, which is, "War is sweet only to those who have not experienced it." So he wrote another one called The Complaint of Peace, in which he said, why do the British hate the French? Why are the Germans warring with, the Spaniards? Huh?
Hear the British and the French.
Yeah.
As if they're separate
That's what he says. Erasmus says, we all are followers of Christ. Why should the Pyrenees divide Spanish from French? Why should the Rhine separate France and Germany? We are all members of the body of Christ. Well, I don't think he's the body of Christ. So absolutely, and here is one of the, again, a paradox where Erasmus, when he translates the Bible anew, he has this wonderful preface, which I think is the most important thing that he wrote, called the Paraclesis. And this is his manifesto about how he wants the Bible to be read by everyone in all the languages. May the weaver at her loom and the farmer at his plow read the verses of Christ. And so he saw his new Bible as providing the template that then people would use to translate it into all the languages. And in fact, Luther did use that, translate it into German. So what happened? When the Bible gets translated into these new languages, it takes on the coloration of all the countries where the language is. And Luther went out of his way to address it to the German people. And he, for instance, William Tyndale, translating the English Bible for the unpronounceable name of God, the Tetragrammaton, he came up with Yahweh, because that is, if you vocalize the yud, hey, that's what it would be. Luther used the word Herr, H-E-R-R, like Lord or Mr. in German. And so it added to this idea of God being a sort of a German figure. And so, whereas Erasmus thought that by translating the Bible and calling for it to be in all the languages, he would add to a united Christendom. In fact, it led to the breaking down. And this one, Elizabeth Eisenstein, who wrote the great historian of printing, she has a wonderful thing about how the Bible, printing both created a republic of letters where all these people could communicate with one another across borders, but it also led to this new nationalism. Because once the Bible and these other works were in the vernacular, people began identifying and interpreting the Bible according to their own national aspirations.
Thank you. What would you tell us, given that the Holy Roman Empire was totally against the vernacular, the Gutenberg Bible, printing press, etc., how did they react to all these vernaculars? Because their power came through the use of Latin that most people didn't understand. So as soon as it opened the gates, this would take away from their authority.
Absolutely.
In a sense.
That's why the church basically had a ban on, it varied, but in some places there was a ban on vernacular Bibles. And also there were bans on people reading them on their own. And one of the amazing stories that I stumbled upon as a journalist trying to bring out is how Henry VIII and the Archbishop of Canterbury tried to suppress the English translation. William Tyndale, who was inspired by this Paraclesis he read this and he decides, I want to translate the Bible into English. And there were no printed English Bibles at that point. What's that? Did Bishop Cranmer also do? Cranmer was after. Yeah, he then, so what happens is they oppose this, and actually William Tyndale he can't translate the Bible in England. It's too dangerous. So these merchants supported Protestants because they didn't like the church's laws on usury and whatnot. So they paid for Tyndale to go to Europe, to the continent. And there he's in hiding and whatnot, and he translates the Bible into English. And word goes out that this Bible is going to start appearing in England. And so all points bulletins are put out at the ports, and they begin searching. The Bibles are hidden in the barrels and of clothing being brought in. And Tyndale is a hunted man, and Moore leads the hunt against him. This is one of the horrible things. Hilary Mantel in her book, Wolf Hall, she is one of the people who actually presents Moore as a sort of heretic hunter, which is very different from the saintly image that we have. But what happens? Within a few years, Henry changes. Anne Boleyn becomes a supporter of translating the Bible into English. And the whole mood in the country changes, where they decide, because Henry is breaking with the church, that an English Bible could actually help break the authority of the Vulgate, which Erasmus was trying to correct. And poor William Tyndale, first of all, poor More, loyal Catholic, his king turns against the church, More pays the price. But More all the while is hunting Tyndale and wants to basically execute him for having dared to translate the Bible into English. He was also a very strong follower of Luther, so he was a polemical Protestant, Tyndale. But even after, so the Bible, Henry puts a stamp of approval on the Bible. It leads to Cranmer later, who then authorizes another version. But poor William Tyndale was hunted down by Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor, who did not want this Lutheran to survive. And Tyndale went to the stake in 1536, a year after More, his great hunter, was also executed. So the vernacular translations did, in fact, break the authority of both the Church and the Holy Roman Empire.
We have one last question.
Thank you. Actually, this is what I wanted to ask you about Mantell's interpretation of Sir Thomas More, because it's very different from what I had been led to believe. But she points out that he supported torture, that he was intractable, as you say, and I wonder, what is your interpretation of this?
I myself was struck by reading this, that this man who was sainted, beatified, had this history of heresy hunting, and it's very disturbing.
Yes.
He wrote what some people say is the longest religious tract in the English language, like a 500,000-word denunciation of Tyndale and everything associated with him. And it's just a great tragedy that he himself succumbed to the fanaticism of the period, but he himself was infected by it and became this hunter. So I actually try to weigh, he and Luther both stood up for their ideas. Luther at the Diet of Worms, and More going to the Tower of London for his beliefs. And whereas Luther felt sure he was going to die for it, he in fact survived, whereas Thomas More was the one who ultimately was killed. And Erasmus people said when More was killed, they said, Erasmus did not they looked to him to make this statement of support for his friend.
Yes.
And beyond just a few sort of tepid statements, he never did. And partly it was because he didn't want to upset Henry VIII, who still was very powerful, but he also was sort of very upset that his friend had himself succumbed to the fanaticism of the period.
Now, if you don't mind just this comment, I've lived in France recently, and they believe that the period that we're going through is une époque charnière. That is a turning, like the Industrial Revolution or the French Revolution. And don't you think that in some periods, some people can go half of the way, but they can't quite make it into the new, more advanced thinking? I mean,
So who are you referring to there?
Well, I'm referring to Sir Thomas More.
Oh, to More.
Yes, that's right. And, Newton apparently believed in witchcraft to a certain extent, and Thomas Jefferson, didn't believe.
But More didn't just it wasn't going all the way. He took refuge back into the church because he, like Luther, oddly enough, even though the two were sort of enemies, feared anarchy.
Yeah.
He feared what he saw
chaos.
happening when the peasants rose up,
Yeah.
for instance, in Germany. Mm-hmm. He feared the same thing. So he ends up taking refuge in this need for the church to maintain order.
Yes.
And it's fascinating if you go and read Utopia, More's great work, where he actually has passages about religious toleration in there, as long as you agree to certain basic principles. But it's also an orderly world.
Yes.
He very much wanted to preserve order. And if you spoke out too loudly and upset the populace, then there were very severe penalties.
Well, it's fear of chaos, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly.
Thank you very much, Michael. And Todd, thank you very much.
Thank you, guys.